thanks everybody for coming. If you haven't been here all day and you're just seeing me for the first time, I'll introduce myself. I'm Becky Amato. I'm the Associate Director of the Urban Democracy Lab here at NYU. And the Urban Democracy Lab is a place that brings together scholars, practitioners, activists, artists, all sorts of people interested in urban issues, particularly urban social justice issues, around the table to talk about these issues. And we tend to focus a lot on affordable housing, the built environment, greening, gentrification, labor justice, economic justice, environmental justice, all sorts of issues like those. And meanwhile, we've also started a new initiative on, well, we've been doing this work for a while, but now we're calling it an initiative, the Urban Humanities and Their Publics. And this symposium is sort of launching that initiative. So I'm really excited that we've been able to get together all day today and that we have our great keynote speakers to bring it all together this evening. Before I turn it over to Heather Lee, who is actually one of the co-organizers of this symposium, who's going to introduce our speakers, I wanted to make a couple of announcements and also thank people, which I should have probably done earlier today. But I wanted to thank all of the people who've really helped to make this day happen. So those people include Victor Batista, our videographer, who's really been great with a lot of the technology today. Jason Lanning, who is here to set up the coffee and help with some technology and make sure there were cookies. For those of you who are still eating them, please finish them. And Sierra Dismore and Sophie Uwabi, who are not here right now, but they helped to reserve the rooms. And then Scott Collard, Noah Fuller, Jenny Kajowski, Kimon Karamidas, Heather, for helping me get through organize the content for the symposium. And then all of our co-sponsors, NYU Shanghai, the Institute for Public Knowledge, this is kind of their space, the APA Institute at NYU, and of course, all of our speakers and workshop leaders. So a couple of announcements. I announced earlier this evening an event that we are co-sponsoring on April 25th at Gallatin at 1 Washington Place in the theater there. It's an event with activist Winona LaDuke titled Standing Rock, the Seventh Generation and an Economics for Us All. I think that's going to sell out, so if you're interested in hearing from Winona LaDuke, who's a pretty well-known Native American activist, then you should probably RSVP for that pretty soon. And then another event that's coming up sooner, a week from Monday, April 17th, at NYU's Deutsches Haus, which is over on University Place. It's an event that Deutsches Haus and Urban Democracy Lab organized. It's called Welcome to the Occupation. That is an REM reference for anybody who likes REM. Welcome to the Occupation, Squatting, and Resistance from Berlin to New York. And that event is at 6 p.m. So again, housing issues are always top of mind for us at the Urban Democracy Lab. So thanks again for coming. I'm going to turn the mic over to Heather. Thank you.
Thank you all for staying. This has been a really rich and exciting day. As Becky mentioned, I'm actually usually based in Shanghai, so it's a great opportunity for me to be here and to be sort of a convergence of many sort of strands in my life. This event wouldn't have happened without Becky's enthusiasm and tireless organizational and amazing capacity to organize as well. So she is really the rest of us were involved, but none of this would have happened without her. So we really don't deserve any credit. She deserves all the credit. Another way in which I'm really honored to be up here is this is also a convergence of another sort of set of events in my life. I was reading Feeding Gotham when I went to the Urban History Association they have a conference every 2 years, and I happened to see that Gergely Baics, yes, Gergely Baics was on the program, and I thought, oh, that's so great that he's coming out with new material, and how unusual that he is co-presenting. So this is in history, if you're not familiar with the field, we tend to like single author. We are sole authors, we are sole voices, we have authoritative perspectives on things. So the fact that he was co-presenting was very unusual. I went to their panel and I was blown away by Feeding Gotham, and I was, again, sort of, this was one of those rare moments in a conference when you see not only somebody charting out in a monograph like a whole new field, but then you see two people pioneering a whole new way in which history and can collaborate with other fields. We can think about, we can bring to each other through collaboration skills that maybe the other doesn't have, but to share sort of a central question that charts a whole new way of understanding space and place. And I am so in awe of what they've done, and I'm so honored that they are here to present. Not only that, they're going to do this, but they like go back and forth between the slides too, and I really love the dynamism of the pair of them. So it's a huge pleasure that they're here today to present, to talk about their methodology, and sort of they presented the conclusions of their recent article that was featured in The Atlantic. So if you haven't read either the article, at least read about it in The Atlantic. So it's really great high-level summary of sort of the nitty-gritty that they get into the article. So it's what I love about this presentation and how they're going to present it is they think about sort of the conceptual underpinning of what they're doing. So this is you're not here to hear me talk, so I'm going to shut up now and give it to our keynote speakers. Thank you so much.
All right. So thank you for the very kind introduction, and thank you very much for the opportunity to present here the keynote. Our talk is titled Data in Context, Lessons from Urban Space. You hear me, right? So it's okay. Data in Context, Lessons from Urban Space. And what we will do is really kind of push forward the idea that probably the proper way, one proper way to humanize data is to really put data back into context. And in order to do that, we'll draw various lessons from spatial analysis from our own research. So inevitably, it is also a reflection on our collaboration for the past 3-4 years by now. And therefore, it's also a joint keynote, which frankly, I have never done before, nor have I seen before. So hopefully it will be making it more dynamic. I do the introduction, then we'll go between project, and then Leah will sum it up. That's kind of the idea. And so a good place to start is really introducing the framework we have in mind. And that is, we have really an exciting moment in terms of an abundance of data out there. That's really exciting, but there's also danger in that. And that is, we frame the data in search of a question. And I think many of us have seen this before: great data, extremely sophisticated analysis, but it's unclear what the actual question really is. What is the contextually relevant question to ask to that data? That's one thing we have to worry about. But this goes the other way around as well. In humanities research, we have really exciting questions, well contextualized, sophisticated, but what is the appropriate data to address that question? Where do we find it? Do we have the technical skills to really use that data, to analyze? And for example, once we have the data, is the data capable only answering the question that we asked to it, or are there all sorts of other questions embedded in the data we haven't even thought about, partly because of the limitations of our skill set? So what we really suggest here is kind of a virtuous circle, an iterative process, a feedback loop between data and question. We need new data to answer new questions. The data will raise a host of new questions, re-articulate our questions. We go back to data, more data, different data, back to question, go around, go around. And it actually really helps reconceptualize the research process we have in mind. And that is really what we mean by putting data in context in order to really humanize data. So the next thing is, what is really that we mean by context? We mean at least three things. There is the obvious thing, the context of the question itself. We have to ask contextually relevant questions to the data. We need to know our subject. But there is another one, which is the context of the data itself. And we have heard many very interesting talks about really the critical engagement with the data itself. I'm a historian by training, not a data person. I don't call it data, I call it sources. I actually wear two hats on it. I'm an economic historian, I talk to economists and social scientists, I talk data. I talk to historians, I talk sources. And it's not just semantics. Humanities are very self-aware about the production of the data, sometimes maybe too self-aware. But we need to worry about it. Data is just another set of sources. We need to apply the same kind of source criticism that we apply to any primary source. We have to worry about the production of the data, its intentionality, embedded arguments, and so on and so forth. That is, we not only need to know our subject, we need to know our data, its production, how it was made at the first place. And then there is the context of the research process itself. Much of really, and we've seen many examples, much of really exciting humanities data type of work will happen in a collaborative space. We need to interact with people with complementary skill sets. In our case, much of the data comes from the New York Public Library. We actually had Ben Verschoft here, who is, I think, gone, but he is one of the people who's been really involved with the NYC Spacetime Directory project, which is exactly where some of the data that we use come from. The point is we need to engage the people who actually are responsible for the data. We need to understand where they come from, their constraints, how they made it, how crowdsourcing was done, that kind of stuff. We also need to know the subject. So our collaboration has come with basically, I'm a 19th century urban historian focusing on New York City. I kind of know mid-19th century New York City. But then we need to know what to do with the data. That's where Leah originally entered the equation. She knows spatial analysis. The point is not just that we need complementary skill sets, but we would like to emphasize that we also need to meet somewhere halfway in between. Leah needs to learn about New York City history in order to really kind of design methods and tools that are appropriate for that city. And I need to learn spatial analysis. I need to be able to reproduce many of the analyses that we do in order to be able to articulate questions that are relative to the context and the data itself. So these are the three things that, that we mean, and what we'll do is kind of demonstrate these feedback loop, this iterative process through analysis we've been doing. The examples come from spatial analysis. Obviously, that's what we do, but we do not believe that this framework is limited to that. It could be applied to basically any ways of humanizing data, data in the humanities. And before we move on to the particular projects themselves, just basically some ideas about mapping. We would like to distinguish between three kinds of mapping, which not incidentally also correspond to three kinds of maps that we tend to distinguish in cartography. Mapping as reconstruction, reference maps, mapping as process, analytical maps, and mapping as presentation, thematic maps. And mapping as reconstruction is really where much of AGIS work is by definition located. Essentially, we put geographic features on a map. We put dots and lines and shapes and so on a map. We reconstruct. It's very productive and it's necessary. It's often also a first step. At least that's what we'd like to argue. The full potential of the work is one step further, which is what we mean by mapping as process. When you make the process of the mapping analysis integral to the entire research project itself. That's exactly the feedback loop that we mean. Context, question data, data in context. And that is basically, we could call analytical maps. And then, of course, there's the issue of how we present. And we'll focus mostly on mapping as process today. Really, that is really the focus of the framework we suggest. And there is also, of course, the communication of our findings or arguments, which is mapping as presentation, thematic maps. Most of the maps you see are obviously thematic maps, but they are the result of an analytical process of analytical maps that you don't really see necessarily, but every map, the end result that you see is the product of hundreds of maps that happened before, which is the research process. And so in what follows, we'll have 4 projects, 2 of which are single author, 2 of which are co-authored, in order to demonstrate this argument. And a place to start is mapping as process. And for that, we thought that actually we'll use, as an example, my book, Feeding Gotham. It was published recently in September 2016. And the reason we thought it's a good example is because really making mapping integral to the research process in this book, it has done to me what probably is the best, the most productive way in which I could have engaged mapping. It reorganized my central question. I originally started, basically the full title is Feeding Gotham, the Political Economy and Geography of Food in New York 1790-1860. And originally, I set out really mapping the geography of the food markets of New York. It's already interesting, but what mapping as process did to me is ask a different question. The geography of food access in New York, it's different. I think it's a contextually more interesting question, more relevant, more consequential in its arguments. But it really was a long process. It took me years to really articulate a better question. So just some examples from the book of kind of illustrating this data question kind of approach and mapping as process. I started out pretty much doing reconstruction, mapping as reconstruction, using all sorts of data, maps and so on and so forth, to just really pretty much put dots and streets and lines on a map, trying to map the food markets of New York in the early half of the 19th century. And that resulted in what you might call reference maps, really seeing this data visually. Much of the data was really not out there, so I had to create it. The real payoff was not really the mapping the markets themselves, but seeing the data visually, cartographically, which raised a whole host of new questions back to data. Can I say something about the relative volume of trade of the markets? Issues about supply. If I ask questions about supply, can I ask something about demand? Is supply meeting demand? So a second set of maps overlaying the market maps on board-level population density. It's a rudimentary way, but not much better we have available for the time to ask questions about supply and demand. These are maps from 1790 through 1816. But then I'm again in trouble. I have the historical context to worry about. So my narrative is one of deregulation. Much of food markets in New York City, food provisioning, food access was conducted through municipally managed and owned public markets in the early 19th century. But by the 1830s, 40s, the city is moving towards deregulation. By the mid-19th century, we have virtually a fully deregulated food economy in New York. The problem with that is that it's much easier for me to map 13 food markets than it is to map 4,000 or 5,000 food shops, all dispersed across the space. There's no maps to go back to. I need the city directors, they need to be geocoded, there is no address locator for the time, a whole host of technical problems. Now, luckily for me at the time, the New York Public Library was just putting out amazing data. We'll talk more about it, about building footprints from the time from 1854, which allows me to build an address locator and so on and so forth. So back to reference map, putting a lot more dots on the map. Now, well over 20, 30,000 different locations, business addresses, home addresses, and so on and so forth, right? This is also the moment when I actually met Leah. I had this data. I had a specific question to it. I wanted to use it as an address locator. She sees the data and she gets excited, not because of geocoding, but because of all the other possibilities that data can do, which I haven't really fully appreciated. So I realized that, okay, so now I have grocery stores, meat shops, bakeries. It's a whole different scale. Ward level is no longer getting me anywhere in terms of demand. I need to get down to the corner, to the street, to the block. So we managed to build, from that data, a population density map, which is in the upper left corner. The first population density map for New York City for that early period of the mid-19th century. And that is compared to the density of retail shop, groceries, meat shops, bakeries of New York City at the time. Back to analytical maps, or thematic maps in this case. But really the idea is back to analysis. How does the organization of the food economy corresponds to kind of population density or something like that? And a host of other maps that I'm not showing. I'm really focusing on the process. Mapping the location of food shops also, where do they fit in the larger commercial economy of the city? I'm not just shifting scale, I'm shifting context, expanding context. The upper left corner is one of my favorite maps. It's basically all retail shops in New York City in 1854, about 14,000 of them. And then I have in the lower right corner all the food shops, about 4,000. And then in the lower left corner, all the clothing shops. A totally different geography between food and clothing, both of which are part of the entire commercial geography of New York City. Suddenly, I'm no longer just asking a question about the food economy, but where does the food economy fit into the commercial economy of the city, the built environment of the city, a whole new context, right? So that is really, and there's a lot of other examples. We just wanted to draw some examples to kind of demonstrate this iterative process that helps put data back in context, always contextualize in the historical city itself, in order to ask new questions, articulate better questions, more relevant questions, integrate new data, build new data where appropriate, shift scale always to the right scale where you need to be. And that's not just for spatial analysis. You always have to manage the scale appropriately to your problem. And the last point I'd like to make is that this involved always kind of one additional step of learning of GIS, which is fine. I have a rule of thumb about that I only learn as much as necessary for my particular set of problems. I'm not a spatial analyst. That's not what I do. But I need to know the necessary tools. And when I don't know, I go to someone like Leah. So I pass it now to her, and she'll talk about the next idea learning from the city.
Oh, no. We're going back and forth. Like, so Heather met us, I think we swapped like 4 times in a 15-minute talk, but I am short, so there you go. And we're not gonna switch that rapidly, but we're still going. Hi, I'm Leah. But as Gergely sort of introduced, our talk is pretty centrally about a research process and the process of our collaboration and the kinds of lessons we've been able to take out of a mode of working and a mode of researching and this sort of continual feedback loop. So by necessity, talking about our process involves a little bit of personal narrative. And so Gergely's also already mentioned this moment when he had this phenomenal data set and comes into my office because he wants to use it as reference data for the purpose of geocoding. And frankly, I see it and I just cannot help myself, right? So I am trained as an architect and an urban planner. I'm a GIS methodologist and a general urban researcher. Historian, I am not. Right, I've only ever worked on contemporary cities as a planner, trying to think about the future, only sometimes thinking about the past as far as how we got here. But nonetheless, I see this, and what you're looking at is a very small subset of a GIS data set. It comprises over 60,000 building footprints in Manhattan, south of 42nd Street, from 1852 to 1854. The information tied to those building footprints includes the primary land use category per building, the primary land use category per building, as well as whether that building also happens to include a retail shop on the ground floor. It tells you the building material of that building, of each individual structure. Obviously, inherent in the spatial data is its location, its size, its shape, its relative positioning given its context, its sort of built environment context, and a whole host of other auxiliary notes and comments, right? And all I can think of is all of the possibilities, like the sorts of spatial questions, the urbanistic questions that I would normally want to ask with a data set this rich, especially since I know at this point very little about the historic city. And then I sort of, a couple quick experiments. I even made some heat maps, and a few of you in the room know how I feel about heat maps. But I'll admit to it, and we quickly realized, as far as, Gergely mentioned each of us having to meet each other halfway, that we needed to go back to the source material, right? So where this data set comes from, thank you so much. This happens to be an example of the source material. What you're looking at is one sheet out of William Paris's 1852 to 1854 Fire Insurance Atlas of New York City. It's the precursor to the Sanborn map, and we saw one example of Sanborn's earlier today. So many of you might be familiar with the Sanborn. It's the first of its kind fire insurance atlas in the United States. It's significant for a wide variety of reasons that I'm not going to go into. And among those cartographic innovations that Paris introduced, right, is through a system of color coding and additional symbols. He encoded into this atlas all of those various attributes, the land use information, the building material, and so on. And clearly, because it's an atlas, we have a sense of, again, the size, the shape, the location of each of these buildings. And going to this, then again, there are a number of lessons that can be gleaned from the source material itself, from understanding the data set as a primary source and conducting that source criticism, thinking about the context in which it was created. You have to remember that the reason why the land use information is in this atlas to begin with is that it's serving purposes of aiding in insurance underwriting. decisions, right? And this is the city about 60 years before the institution of comprehensive land use zoning. So the reason why land use is pertinent here is because any building could be of any use, anywhere. Right? And that got us thinking, right? It's from the source material, it's doing that source criticism, the intentionality behind the data set in the first place, not only the atlas, but also the libraries, resources, and their intention in the system by which it was first scanned and then georeferenced, and the digitizing, which was a massive, heroic crowdsourcing effort. So it gave us sort of an insight into the digital structure of the data set. Both of those two things together, thinking about doing that source criticism, gave us a way forward, right? It gave us a starting place to think about questions about land use, and also started to point to how we might analyze the digital information, understanding how the digital information was made. And so, you know, admittedly, our first pass was we took an axe to the data. Like, okay, now we've got some questions about land use. To be fair, we weren't asking a specific question about land use. We just knew we were interested in land use. So and our early analysis kind of reflects that. So we disaggregated the data set by use type. That's why you see 3 different maps, and aggregated each of those building footprints to their respective blocks, and start to see a sort of image of the city in terms of its land use geography. And while I'll say it's a crude first pass at analysis, it certainly isn't just mapping the building footprints as we saw them earlier. It's not everything. But that said, there's still a lot to learn here. Again, we're in the middle of this feedback loop. Each time you map it, we get new questions and so on. And so, for example, it gives us a pretty succinct image of the city as a kind of time capsule. We can see the firm establishment, the clear establishment of a downtown central business district with commercial activity winding their way up Broadway and the Bowery, and also up the riverfronts as port activities. We see the shift then moving northward along the riverfronts to the city's industrial economy. Right, but we also see pretty low levels, but consistent levels of industry across the island in its interior. These reflect sort of smaller workshops that were basically everywhere. And then similarly, basically everywhere, very intense levels of residence. Right, we see residential uses on every block everywhere. We really only void where there are insane levels of commercial activity or on the industrial waterfront. And this starts to raise new questions, right? That clearly we're not seeing the whole picture. You go back to the historical record, you think about your context, and you realize, well, we know that residential activity and industrial activity, well, we're clearly seeing that they're mixed throughout most of the island. They can't be mixed evenly throughout most of the island. We know that certain communities have started to institute restrictive covenants. We know that population is not evenly distributed. So we're realizing that our first pass, while it gives us some insight, without thinking really about the city we're analyzing, because 1850s New York is definitely not our New York. We might not be asking the right questions, or might not be employing methods of analysis that could answer those questions. So we took a step back and reframed our question and reframed our approach to the analysis, our approach to the data that might be able to be more reflective of the 19th century condition. And in this case, what you're looking at are the results of taking every residential building footprint and measuring its distance to its 30 nearest commercial buildings and its 30 nearest industrial buildings. For the purposes of presentation and looking at overall patterns, we then mapped the average distances by block across the city. So the red is obviously the relationship between residential and commercial. The map on the right is the relationship between residents and industry. And you can see in the areas that are red and or purple, respectively, those are neighborhoods where dwellings, where people's homes are significantly closer than average to commercial activity, commercial uses, as well as industrial uses. And what we see, I'm going to point with the cursor, up here, essentially, those are your wealthier, more elite neighborhoods, and what you're looking at is the cumulative effects of those restrictive covenants, right? What's interesting here is that this is an approach that starts to speak to it's a potentially transferable approach. We're asking questions not assuming that we know how near is close or how far is far. right? There's no input of distance. That's an output of our analysis. And we're essentially asking, well, how far is far enough to feel like you've been able to command your distance from specific nuisances? And how tightly packed or how mixed together are the sort of poorer and immigrant neighborhoods in this context? What's that relative span? The same goes or can be said for population density, right? This mapping population density by block. So you're looking at our estimates for population density by block, which we were able to derive from by distributing the residential concentration per block within each ward, and therefore we were able to disaggregate the ward level census numbers, right, and estimate that therefore by block. It is the highest resolution population density map made of this time period. So that's pretty fun. Right, and it gives us a pretty nuanced, I think, or technically sophisticated image of the sort of very differentiated social geography of New York at that time. You see these intensely dense neighborhoods in the 5 Points in the Lower East Side, versus, once again, those wealthier sort of neighborhoods, much less dense. But it still doesn't necessarily give us an on-the-ground sort of 19th century feel of density. At this time period, people within the city, various city agencies, I believe the Municipal Board of Health, was working on estimating population density by block. Their first sort of pass or successful map of the city of density by block was produced about a decade after this time period. But population density doesn't speak to the concern about density at the time period. The concern about density wasn't a matter of enumeration, and they didn't think of it in terms that we do today, the number of people per acre, right? It wasn't a question of counting. It was a question of the built environment. It was a question of crowding, right? Given the dominance of the miasmatic theory of disease at the time, and again, we're coming back to the context, putting the analysis itself into the mindset of the time period. Given the miasmatic theory of disease, the general belief here was that adequate access to light and air was essential for good health, and that lacking that access was potentially life-threatening, right? And this, again, is a question of the built environment. So you're looking at our estimation, so relative levels of crowding, which we ended up defining as the ratio between rear lot tenements, and those are the residential buildings that by definition have limited access to light and air because they don't face the street, right? They're built in between in the interiors of the blocks, versus the unbuilt total square footage of that block. So how much square access or open land was around them. And this blue map is in fact weighted by population density in the end. I'm happy to talk methods later in the Q&A if you want. But the takeaway here is that, or one of the takeaways here is that it's that the blue map, the crowding map, while the pattern is somewhat similar to the population density map, it gives us insight into certain neighborhoods the population density map couldn't, right? We can see pockets of crowding that the population density map obscured. We can see that there are islands of poverty that that density wasn't able to show us. In some, right, if we look at all of these together, I would say that the maps on the top row, well, yeah, they take some technical savviness, and I will always love that population density map. It's one of my favorites of the whole collaboration. They have much to offer us in terms of insight. They tell several stories and they get us closer. But they don't describe New York City in the 19th century in its own terms, right? When we think about the maps on the bottom, we're taking our measures from the city itself, which is to say we're taking our measures or our metrics from the context of the data and the city they're hoping to represent. And once we realized that we could move in that direction, once we started thinking this way, we also realized that these maps are only telling us half the story of the city. And now I'm giving it back to Gergely.
So the next thing we'll look at is the street grid of New York. And here the idea really is to defamiliarize something that is rather familiar, the street system of New York itself, and to kind of reconceptualize it spatially. And so where Leah left it off is the idea that before we aggregated the building footprints to the block. But where I already made that point before, right, that we kind of need to treat our data as if they were just primary sources in other fields, which means, and when we do that in history, right, we need to learn to read between the lines. We need to do the same thing with the maps themselves. The spaces in between the building footprints are actually the streets. And those are empty spaces in our data in a way, but those are actually meaningful spaces. A building is not only sitting on a block, it's also facing a street. And so when we started to think that way, we said, well, there's another way of aggregating all this data, another meaningful geographic unit, which is the street that the buildings face. If we wish, we usually say this, we turn the data inside out. In the process, we created a whole new data set. All of these footprints aggregated to the street segment level that they face, which describe a city in a conceptually different way. So again, taking a first cut and looking at the same maps, these are the same, basically land use maps, commerce, industry, and residence, but now at the street segment level. And we think they are quite interesting themselves. We talk a fair amount of them in our writing. But what is far more interesting than those three for now is really the fourth one, which is all the ground floor retail commercial establishments of New York City at the time aggregated to the street segment level. So when you look at it closely, this is really one of that moment that we had a data, we aggregated it a new way, that created a new data, we mapped it, we looked at it, and it was a little bit for us a revelation that suddenly we see something that we haven't even thought before, a new relationship between the street system itself and the land use environment of New York itself. And when you really look at this map, what you see is that the city is kind of divided in two halves. And that is defined by the New York City grid, the grid of 1811. If you're on the grid, pretty much all commercial establishments and retail shops crowd onto the avenues. If you're below the grid, below Houston Street, they kind of crisscross, zigzag the city in multiple directions. Now, this, of course, corresponds to our own experience of the city itself. When we walk the avenues, we enjoy the energy of the avenues, the hustle, bustle, and so on. We take a left or right turn, it's residential, it's more quiet, it's more tranquil. And of course, it would have been easy to assume that this is some sort of a fabrication, a creation of zoning codes from 1916 on. But here we have a map to show that it was already in place, at least as far as commerce goes, in 1852-54. It was created by market mechanisms at the time and the morphology of the street system itself. So one thing is how we explain these two different patterns. A bigger question, to what extent is morphology, street form, an incentive of land use zoning, if you wish? And even further than that, should we think of street form as an institution of land use incentives? So these are questions that pop out for us from this map. How do we explain this? So we were thinking about it. Why would a retail establishment go on the avenues? And it must be an issue about accessibility, connectivity. If you're a shopkeeper, you want to be in an accessible location, right? So that seems to make sense. What would a map of accessibility of New York City, of the New York City street system, would look like? And so this is actually my favorite map, the one there, which is a map that is completely created to answer that question. What we do in this map is we measure the relative accessibility of any point on the street system in New York below 42nd Street at every 10 feet apart, within a 3 minutes walking distance. The warmer the color, the more accessible you are. The colder the color, the less accessible that specific location is. And so when you look at, and mind you, this is a decision on our part, a 3 minute walking distance. This is some sort of we kind of take it from the city. It could be also reflecting on mass transit, omnibuses mostly at the time. It could be multimodal, factoring in walking and mass transit. Leah says she can do it. I will believe her. But the point is that what you see in front of you is basically your argument about this, but also a representation of what relative accessibility in the city street system looks like, with no input really from us other than setting the 3 minutes issue. And what you really clearly see, once you're on the grid, the avenues are far more accessible locations than the streets. Now, an easy explanation would be right, and that's what other people have argued before. Avenues are more commercial than streets because they are wider. In fact, that's one of the key dimensions of the grid. Avenues are 100 feet wide, streets are 60 feet wide. You obviously, as a shopkeeper, want to be on a wide avenue. Mind you, in this map, width is not factored in at all. The only thing that we factor in is the block dimensions. The Manhattan grid have rectangular blocks. They are quite elongated in shape. What that means is you're walking the avenue, the blocks are shorter. You're walking the street, the blocks are longer. You're walking the avenue, to put it in a different way, intersections come more frequently. The more frequent the intersections, the more accessible the location. So the only thing this map demonstrates is connectivity, accessibility based on the simple variable of the block dimensions, which in fact is a different thing also, regularized intersections, right? And so what it allows us, and you compare these two maps, it pretty well corresponds. What it allows us to do kind of is to explain that. But what is even more interesting, it allows us to reframe a way of thinking about the grid itself. We tend to describe the grid as a system of streets and blocks. 100 feet wide avenues, 60 feet wide cross streets, rectangular blocks. What we suggest that that's fine, that's a perfectly legitimate explanation, framing for some questions. But if we want to think about the grid as a system of land use incentives, another way of framing it is a system of intersections, regularized intersections, which create differential variable levels of accessibility and connectivity along its path. And that's just a different way of thinking about it. It leads me to ask a question such as, leads us to ask a question, to what extent does the grid have agency in incentivizing land use? To what extent does the form of the street system itself act in incentivizing land use? It starts to be quite interesting question, at least for us. And so I will leave it at that. So far we've been talking about kind of articulating new or better questions and data, designing tools and methods that are taken from the city itself, measures taken from the city itself, and optimally really kind of reconceptualizing frameworks that we thought we know, defamiliarizing the familiar. And I think this all speaks to the issue of humanizing data. The next logical step would be to put context in practice. And so Leah will continue with that.
So right. I think we wouldn't want to presume that everybody in the room is a historian and is only going to work with historical data. But also, I think, especially following up the first panel after lunch, right, wanting to talk about how some of these lessons, and we've been slowly building that list of lessons down the right-hand side of this slide, can be put into practice and what they sort of offer. So before I show any maps, I'm going to give a context of a project. The project I'm going to show comes out of my work a couple years ago, and I'll say it's 2014. The project's called Re-envisioning Branch Libraries. It was a design it was a design research project commissioned and supported by the Center for an Urban Future and the Architectural League of New York. They brought together 5 interdisciplinary teams to think about the 207 branch libraries in New York City. And so we've been talking a lot about context, so I'll give you even more context. There are 207 branches. In 2014, they had come together about a little bit over $100 million in basic capital needs. We're talking just what it would take to get these buildings to a state of good repair, right? They're falling apart. They belong to 3 separate administrative systems, which is a little bit of a nightmare sometimes. They were talking the New York Public Library, the Queens Public Library, and the Brooklyn Public Library. And all together, those 3 systems and their 207 branches, each serving very specific and diverse communities across the city, comprise literally $0 in the city's budget. Right? They're not a line item on the budget, and they have to do their fundraising very piecemeal, which means they have to do their decision making, their planning, both for their physical assets, but also for their programming, equally piecemeal. Right? There's no we'll say to call integrated, holistic, or strategic decision-making difficult would be a severe understatement. So needless to say, there's a lot of advocacy work on behalf of the libraries as they try to think through their future. And so one of the questions charged to my team was to think about how we would, A, conceive of the libraries as a networked system, and B, try to leverage the data available both within each of the library systems, but also by the city's data, open data available for state and federal agencies, to really understand their needs and their opportunities to allow for long-term decision making. I think the immediate want is to take all of that available data and just map it, right? Understand, well, what's the geography of opportunity and constraint and limitation, and who are the communities that each of these branches serve? And what you're looking at here, and sometimes we could say even layer some of those maps together, and maybe that would hopefully give us some insight. Right, and what you're looking at here is, we could say 2.5 variables like mapped together. The grayscale on the bottom, or the lower level layer, is population density by acre. The green circles give you the locations of each of the branches. The size of the circle is their per capita visitor rate, which itself implies an additional data set in that it's taking the local population, and by local I mean within a half-mile walking distance on the street, so the visitors relative to the local population. And this can be helpful, but again, it's really very valuable when you're trying to dive in and get specific information about individual branches, or maybe make comparisons across branches, thinking through systematically and really trying to think about balancing resources, logistical concerns, et cetera, become rather untenable given the amount of data available and the complexity of the questions facing these systems and their decision makers, right? And we saw this earlier today when we were talking about, I think I myself reach a point of frustration. I'll call myself out. I myself reach a point of frustration, and you feel like the map makes the argument so very clear, right? Especially in some of our sort of activist work. And why don't the decision makers see it? And why don't they do something? And so in response to that, I built a kind of strategic spatial decision support tool, taking all these lessons about what happens when you really contextualize your data. And in this case, the more meaningful, potent context is the political reality of New York today, or at least 2014. So we back up a few years. Let's remember, the major policy agendas of the de Blasio administration are creating and preserving affordable housing, and especially in 2014, we had an influx of funds that needed to go to environmental resilience planning and flood mitigation and vulnerability type things. And so the strategic question here is, can we leverage all that data? And in the end, I pulled together about a little bit more than 200 variables and data sets from different sources to help identify the areas where the needs of the library systems align with the political priorities of the current administration's agenda, right? Because that would help make the case for diverting some of that fund, not necessarily diverting, but repurposing or multi-purposing some of those funds toward the libraries, right? And so, for example, I don't know if you guys can read that. I'll tell you what it says. For example, I pulled together information and modeled what the recent growth trends over the last 10 years have been in the city, trying to find those high demand, high impact, high vulnerability neighborhoods, changes in population density over the last 15 years, right? Individually identifying the development potential of each individual lot. So if you are going to maybe rebuild an existing library or maybe build a new one, can you include affordable housing on that lot? And then, of course, also looking at flood vulnerability and environmental resiliency information to really hone in on those priority neighborhoods, those politically prioritized neighborhoods, which gives us a chance to then identify the conditions of the libraries within those neighborhoods, look for those with development potential, characterize and summarize the sort of communities that they serve, pull out those individual narratives about their sort of post-Sandy experience, if that helps, and really try to argue for or demonstrate that not only are the library systems a sort of educational and social and cultural and informational infrastructure, they might also be sort of resilient infrastructure as well. That can support these other agendas. And will not take credit for this, but a couple months after this study was completed, the City Council did hold a series of hearings, and findings from the research were presented in testimony, and the libraries did get a one-time shot of $40 million. So it's not nothing. It's not nothing. But I wouldn't, like, this approach would not have been the approach if it weren't for really thinking about the full context in which both the data is created, but also it's trying to act, right? And that brings us, I'm gonna pull it all together. I'm gonna try to do some summary takeaway points. That brings us back to the sort of intention of the talk, which is to sort of remind us that despite the newness of the technology and the flashy data, that as researchers, we do need to return or stay focused on sort of some first principles of research, right? And so, you know, I won't restate everything we've said, but I'll just do some reminders. That includes the fact that focused research is both data-driven these days, but it's also question-driven, and that this is an iterative process in which we ask new questions that are then refined by the data available and refined by each step of our analysis, and that especially given that it's spatial, it is scalar. Right? That we're not only asking relationships about things that happen on the ground and over time, we're asking questions about things that happen over space and across different scales, right? That at the same time, that research happens within a specific context. We have to be willing not only to collaborate, but to learn what we need to learn from one another in order to do that productively. I think I'm personally very honored to be part of this collaboration. I think Gergely and our work is greater than the sum of our parts, right? Our collaboration is not a division of labor that's sort of understood by our disciplines, but that we both have a sort of constant commitment to learn from one another. But this also means that such collaborative work has to operate, like there has to be a context for that collaborative work. And while we haven't spent a lot of time explicitly saying this, you know, as academics, we feel that to get to see more of this sort of productive output from this kind of virtuous circle, we need in academia to support and value the results of collaborative research as much as we value the results of single author research. So that needs to be said. And obviously, I can say it again one more time, that we need to situate our data within not only the urban context, but the temporal context, and understand them as, understand our data sets as primary sources. We need to think about the transferability of our approaches, right? Like, again, the way I would analyze New York City today is inappropriate for analyzing New York City in 1850, just as it would be inappropriate for analyzing another contemporary city on the other side of the planet. And we need to be thoughtful and read between the lines. And then lastly, that brings us to where we are going. I will say this. Together and individually, we've come to, when thinking about the transferability of our methods, we've both become very interested in what we are calling socially meaningful distance. Together, we are embarking on another round of research that is evaluating the sort of metrics we take from the city and these distance measures, that sort of near-far analysis that we did we compared land uses with, thinking through how we would use that to evaluate other forms of distance. You guys could probably come up with thousands of different examples, but you know, for example, how we measure segregation and dissimilarity is usually based on sort of arbitrary boundaries rather than the environment or the context from which those measures would be taken. And we are also starting research that compares takes the methods that we've learned from mid-19th century New York and compares them to other contexts, from Montreal to Copenhagen. And if we find that they are not transferable, that is also completely valuable, because we might actually be able to concretely understand the effects of context on those measurements. So that would be great. Gergely is starting a new book project called The Transitional City, Built Environments and Social Distance, 1840s to 1890s. Oh, I did it. I did it. And then in contemporary context, I'm starting new research, a book project yet to be titled, on something that's come up, I think, a lot today, is the effects of data and our modes of analysis and representation, and the extent to which they can or can't represent plural views and understandings and perceptions of space in contemporary cities, and the sort of political effects of that level, those varying levels of representation. Toward that, as a first demonstrative project, I'm starting to develop GIS-based quantitative techniques to mapping the differential experience of space by gender. Which I find quite compelling, but B, I've taken it on mostly because it's a really hard problem because the genders don't cluster spatially. So it's not about looking at from different neighborhoods access to resources, right? It's about the perception of space. And that brings us to one last thing. I'm going to try, this is not the moment to launch a new theoretical reframing of anything, but I'm gonna start with a provocation, none of you could probably read that diagram, but that's fine. I think everybody in the room, or most people in the room, are probably familiar with Henri Lefebvre and his very, very, very well-known spatial triad of the production of space. And if you can't read it, I'll summarize very quickly. Typically, that triad is represented this way as a diagram in a triangle, sort of showing that the representations of space, which are those formal conceptualizations of the city. They're the things that academics make, that engineers make, that architects, urban planners, policymakers construct. They are absolutely, I'm going to go 99% of the times, represented in maps and other types of authoritative documents about the space of the city. And the triangle diagram is all about showing that those representations are related to representational spaces, which are the sort of culturally understood, we think capital P place. They're metaphorical spaces. They're sort of generationally passed down and reenacted as part of lived experience, and that those two, not only are they related, but they are reinstantiated and reified and reproduced and reinforced. I can keep going with these every day through spatial practice, right? The point of the diagram on the right is not to reconceptualize Lefebvre's framework, right? But rather to try to situate data-driven urban practices as spatial practices that are absolutely part and parcel to this process by which space as a socioeconomic product is reproduced through the analysis we conduct, through the maps we make, through the products of our research that we share, right? Through the way we talk about it, and through the making and collecting of data, spatial data itself, right? These days, so in this way, those formal conceptualizations act upon and are informed by the sort of place-based meanings that various communities are able to put forth or to advocate for or to voice, I will say, and that constant feedback loop is served and reinforced through our spatial practices, which in 2017 include our data practices, right? And as like data users within the humanities, I think this is something that we should be mindful of. Hopefully it speaks a little bit to the earlier discussion about power and the role of power in data and mapping. And full disclosure, I'm writing this up. And so like I said, this is not necessarily to open up a giant teaser and then like stop talking about this, but to rather advocate for a thoughtfulness to the analysis, because whether it's the libraries project, which might be one example, or it's redlining, which is a classic example, or it's the new practice of making red and blue maps of the United States, which is a relatively recent invention, but have absolutely come to inform how we think about ourselves in this country. It's an active, spatial, social, participatory act. And with that, thank you very much.
we have questions? Comments?
It's late. I killed it.
So that was a tour de force. Thank you. Just the speed with which you spoke is amazing. I would like to ask the question coming from a experimental research perspective as opposed to having to use data that exists already from some form or another. If you feel that, historically at least, that the result of asking one question, finding one result, changes the question, changes what you look for, changes the question, is relatively novel in the humanities, because that's the first thing I learned when I went to graduate school was that's what happens. You learn from the first experiment how to ask the question better.
And I would take it. I don't think that's why we called it back to basic principles. Okay. And I mean, in all honesty, I don't think it is that novel. What I think is the important piece is that we seem to be forgetting this, or at least that's my concern. That, you know, I mean, I really don't want to do this, and I'm not going to do this, to call out any project, but how many times I hear great data work, big data this, big data that. And after wonderful analysis and extraordinarily sophisticated skills, I'm still wondering, what did I just learn? And so, you know, and then on the other hand, in the humanities, I do think that where we started, it does happen that humanities scholars are often scared of data. They won't go there, and they won't let data inform their analysis because they are worried about the technical skills involved. And so, and no, I do not believe this is that new. I think this is just, that's what we call back to basic principles. Put back data in context. Don't be overwhelmed by data. Don't get frightened by data, but also don't get over-impressed. Data does not exist by itself. It's not supposed to solve, I mean, it's not supposed to substitute thinking and analysis and subject. That's how I would.
I'm gonna halfway answer that. I think Gergo totally did, but I think outside of the humanities and typical humanities-based research, we're in disciplines where data-driven analysis and statistical analysis is very common. I also want to make this back to first principles argument, because I think I say the same. I see the same thing even before the step of analysis. I'm not going to call anybody out, but there's an enthusiasm at the point of visualization, right? That where question never even gets asked. Where like, now I've got this massive data set. It's got a level of detail and resolution that is in itself impressive. So if I make the map, right, then the project is finished and I will make conclusions, sort of forgetting the acts of interpretation and the process of analysis that has to happen, which again is a first principle to research that I'm starting to sound like a broken record, especially to my students, about. And then and this also comes out, or is in relation, or should be compared to disciplines that have a sort of an experimental bent, right, or a tradition of experimentation in the capital E scientific method meaning of that word, where the data that is analyzed is data that is collected for the purpose of testing that hypothesis with controls built into what that, and knowledge, real, like, thoughtful, like, verifiable, valid, defensible clarity about what that data set can and can't attest to, right? Because it was purpose-built. And we need to remember that we need interpretive iteration with our pre-existing data sets, the ones that are either produced by our social mobile technologies constantly, or that are pre-existing our question, that we need a different approach. I wrote a long time ago a piece called "The City is Not a Lab," and I find myself repeating that constantly. So I think for several different disciplines, there's sort of a return to first principles about research that's worthy of repeating now.
Thank you so much. That really was a tour de force and really inspiring. I just wanted to, just picking up on that point, I think there's what you're doing in sort of, and I guess what the whole day has been doing really, is just bringing humanities research into conversation with data is a really important political act, especially in the university today, where a lot of money is being pumped into big data and the resources that support that. So I wanted to come to this. I'm really inspired and just kind of moved by the apparent collaboration that not only in terms of the substance of what you've produced, in terms of this remarkable work, but the kind of conversation that you're having, and so I'm curious when you say like, how might a university recognize that kind of work and support it? Yeah. I'm guessing you might have some thoughts about what that might look like, and I'm sure we'd all love to know how to advocate for that kind of work.
I mean, I will start. I guess Leah will continue. I mean, the one place it's we're both assistant professors, which tells you exactly where we are in tenure process. And that's a big piece of this, right? Is that how do we, in humanities, scholarship is often assumed to be single-authored. How do we recognize collaborative work? And often assumption is, well, an article co-authored is basically half an article, but it's not. That's exactly the point that we'd like to make, that it's not, you're not doing half of the work, you're meeting halfway in between. And actually sometimes you're doing more work because, I mean, I really follow the rule of thumb. If I cannot replicate at all what Leah was just doing, then I'm missing the picture. So, she comes up with the tool, I will learn it. And then I apply to other contexts and so on and so forth. So that is one thing. And that is just an institutional problem. It's not individually at the universities to fix, but there is some mentoring that can help, that we need to really recognize that really, this kind of scholarship, not just this, I mean, just think of the amazing work on the San Francisco case. Now that's outside of academia, but you couldn't have done it without all the different input from all the different places. So we need to kind of cherish this, recognize it, make it part of the academic recognition process. This is how a lot of the work is being done. That's one thing. There's also resource issues. I mean, we have to put the resources. We have to put the resources where our mouth is, really. There's so much big data, this big data, that digital humanities here, digital humanities there. But oftentimes, really, it's unclear where the resources are, the research support that this kind of work needs. We need to train students to help us. And there's a lot of work involved that needs some institution building and that. You will continue, I guess.
I have very little to add. I think you hit all of it. I think the only thing I would add from my perspective, right? I'm not a historian. I think many of my colleagues think it's very interesting that I work with a historian. Oh, that's very interesting. But primarily, I'm a spatial methodologist, and I think about the politics of the methods, or the extent to which different community groups and social groups and perspectives of perceptions of space can be represented in the measurements we use, right? And again, as an architect, I'm trained in thinking about representation. But funnily enough, in trying to take that seriously in the age of data-driven representation, I went through a process about a decade ago where I started learning very technical skills and a lot of spatial statistics and quantitative approaches, despite being trained as a designer. And it's almost as though, when you're thinking about collaborative work, we also talk frequently about interdisciplinary work, even as a solo author, right? And I think it needs to be a general conversation that we're willing to have about what scholarship on urban environments especially looks like right now. I mean, cities are only becoming more important, and they are so important because they are enormously complex. And they are themselves interdisciplinary contexts. So if we want to add thoughtful work or contribute thoughtful work, each of us will become more interdisciplinary in our approaches, and we're going to seek out, like-minded but complementary partners in that. And I think it's almost a paradigmatic shift with the growth of the city comes the growth of a way of studying the city and a commitment to doing that.
I was wondering, with the data that you've gathered, a lot of what you presented is fantastic, and it's geared much more towards like descriptive statistics. I was wondering, with the data set that you have, it might not be the data set that you have might not be sufficient for running other types of analysis, but I was wondering, with the data that you have you run any other type of analysis or plan to run any other type of analysis besides just descriptive statistics?
Yes and yes. Okay, now
Can you talk,
I'll
can you talk more about
yes,
it?
Of course. Okay, so based on the things that we've shown, we didn't talk about it. A few of the maps include, but it wasn't. The methods aren't what we talked about. So a few of the maps you saw included the results of cluster analyses. The land use by block, that first cut of the historic land use maps, includes the identification of significant clustering of each of those uses as a way toward figuring out or hoping to find some statistically significant patterns, at least as a starting point. We've done that pretty consistently. Whether or not they make their way into the final analysis or lead to additional interesting questions, I would say that sort of group of tests is pretty common for us. What else? It's also embedded in the libraries project, but I only showed you 2 maps. And but that as a decision support tool, different approaches to measuring spatial patterns, I built into the different scales of consideration. So even though at every point in the tool, when we say think scalarly and think about scale, for example, even though I showed the city at its most zoomed out level in each one of those images, depending on the sort of question you ask, or if you're thinking about community level, then you would look at descriptive statistics about demographics and who that library branch might serve. If you were looking at those same variables at the citywide level, they were always aggregated into diversity indices to talk, because the integral question at the system level is not exactly who does each library serve, but how diverse or self-similar is the community of that each library serves, because you're thinking about resource distribution. Right, so they're aggregated and summarized in different ways, and then for many of those variables, also an additional level of spatial clustering analysis was performed to show if you're really looking for intense patterns of disparity or certain resource needs. Where can you confidently focus your resources? There were others, but yes. It depends on the question, and it depends on the context, and it depends on the scale, but yes.
You two never fail to excite me in ways in which, I don't know. Thank you so much for the work that you two are doing together and separately, but also synergetically, as you mentioned, together. When I heard you two speak at the Urban History Conference, one of the statements or claims that really was very charged for the room of historians was the idea that the grid had agency. I don't know if you guys remember how heated that. Okay, of course you guys do. I mean, it was something that conceptually, I think it gets to what you were saying, this historian suspicion of data and the role of data beyond just sort of the technical dimensions of what you two do, that sort of mystifies them. So I guess I want to ask, the question I want to ask doesn't actually have to do with historians, but how then you imagine this Manhattan context transporting to Montreal and Copenhagen, whether the grid or their street layout has the same sort of agency, or kind of does it run on a different model, or this is so exciting that you're taking this into a comparative global scope too. So thank you.
Well, as for the agency of the grid, I really like that formulation precisely because, I mean, partly we have that formulation because it seemed to have bothered people at the UHA. And I thought that, okay, so actually I make it in my new book project, it's now a chapter title. And no, I actually don't think the grid has agency. I'm at the end of the day a historian, but I do think the grid provides what we have missed in some ways is morphology provides land use incentives. It incentivizes people to behave in certain ways. We have a largely unregulated land use environment where I can give 200 million caveats to that, but I maintain it is a largely unregulated land use environment where market actors can have so much more freedom than today. And so under those conditions, we have the optimal kind of data to test how the form, the morphology actually incentivizes people's behavior. I think that is a pretty compelling argument. If I call it agency of the grid, I will kind of annoy people enough that they might actually read it. As for transferability, and I will pass it back to Leah, we don't quite know. We have, so this is the trick. What is the city that we want to have? It's Barcelona. If anybody knows of similar data on Barcelona, please give it to us. That's the city to test. Barcelona has the perfect grid for us. It is square shaped, not rectangular, right? And that's actually the grid of most Latin American cities, by the way, but Barcelona really has it. It was drawn in the 1850s. It's gridded that way. If there is any grid in which the morphology of the street form does not really incentivize land use other than corner locations, it is it. So I'm really hoping to get that data. I might have some idea where to get it. We can have data on Montreal, and I've already looked at the data, and it looks similar. So it's a good way to test some of these measures. It's also a largely unregulated land use environment, and so on and so forth. And we have great data on Copenhagen now. We don't know. So the answer is we don't quite know. We'll have to take our measures and so on, go and continue.
So I'm not trained as a historian, so I can answer the agency question differently. I'm trained, not trained as a historian, but I will tell you that urban planners, the grid might not have agency, but I think I'm technically actually supposed to say urban planners who designed the grid definitely have agency. And I do firmly believe that as a cartographer, once it's delineated, and boundaries are created, and blocks are then subdivided into lots within that grid, and real land is financialized as value through that grid. That market definitely it's a system of incentives. If you want to call that agency, and the designers of that system bear that agency / responsibility, then I think we can definitely say that. I agree. It's a provocation to a room full of historians, but that grid wasn't an accident, and it's the result of several human decisions, and those humans definitely have agency. The transferability question, I think you totally answered and nailed in every single way.
I'm not sure of that, but one more thing about the grid. Yes, the commissioners drawing the grid had agency, except the grid they got, we have no idea about their intentions.
Yes,
because what we know about their intentions is so limited. And if there is anything that we know, people actually make arguments that they made these rectangular blocks because they almost had it the other way around. They made the argument assumed about it is that they almost had it the other way around, that they had the more frequent intersection on the avenues because they wanted to draw more streets in order to get faster to the rivers because they were thinking of a commercial city at the first place. So if anything, they wanted to prioritize east-west direction movement, not north-south. Exactly. We don't know. That's the thing. That's the beauty of it. We don't know.
They wrote an algorithm and they had no idea what it would do.
They did. They were. That's the thing. Like the greatest grid, right? That was the exhibition title. It is not the Barcelona. That is the greatest grid because Ildefonso Cerda actually had an idea. He actually had a plan. We know about his grid, not about the New York grid. I would argue it is more just came out that way.
They got it wrong.
Yeah, I do like the idea that the grid has agency, but I prefer your phrasing of it that the designer or the planners had agencies. Having worked for the city myself on those maps, I'm quite familiar with the zoning resolution.
Yeah.
The designers, the planners purposely set the grids at a certain distance. And I'm sure you know that the streets are narrower because of the way the sun comes down. So therefore, they cannot go higher. And that's what happened in Midtown Manhattan, where you have all those plazas. That's because of the sun. So as you said earlier, the light and air is important. For a building on Fifth Avenue to be at the side of the sidewalk, to go straight up, it has a certain height to go. If it wants to go higher, there is a setback.
Yep.
And you have the plaza. So in that sense, the planners and designers have agency toward the grid.
But the map is showed is in 1852-54.
No, I'm aware of that.
That's
Yes,
so
yes.
that's in many ways
Yes,
the beauty of it, that
yes.
it's before.
Yes, I'm
that.
aware of that.
Yeah, but of course you're absolutely
I
right.
do agree with you. But the Midtown plazas are negotiations between
No,
the
you're
city
absolutely
and
right.
the
That's-
developers. Yeah.
Does the relevance of grid have any meaning within context of rural areas? Because all of the Midwest is a 1 mile square grid.
Yes.
So I don't know that our 3-minute walking analysis would be a measure we would take from that context in particular.
During the time the grid was made,
Yeah.
people walked those distances,
So,
however.
of course, yeah. I think the sort of near far, like the accessibility analysis would be interesting to try to transfer to a rural context. But I think, if you don't mind, it would be kind of more fun to respond to that question in more theoretical terms about the delineation of space and the drawing of the map and the sort of carving up of spatial or aerial units for land development, right? The contexts are enormously different, talking about rural America versus Manhattan and the way in which land was parceled and the street systems were laid out. But in both cases, right, the Jeffersonian sort of regularized geometry of land parceling across the Midwest had the same intentionality. The way those maps were drawn and their purpose is very similar to the commissioner's intention in drawing the grid, in that they weren't thinking about the connectivity that would result. They were thinking about the on the map, on the ground, polygonal areas that could be then sold, right? So they were developing tax lots. They were developing new property out of existing land in both of those contexts. But what it becomes interesting is that there is that space in between, right? Despite that's the intention, what has resulted is also a networked system of accessibility that is that's non-homogeneous, right? That there's a hierarchy of access that results from the decisions they made about land speculation, or to facilitate land speculation and to facilitate physical growth and development. That there are, and we're able to start analyzing because we have the data, we have the computational power, we have the willingness to collaborate and learn new contexts. And so it's like we're able to start to unpack some of those consequences. I think we can ask questions like that.
Just one more comment on it. So, I mean, a way in which the grid has been obviously described is a system of land subdivisions.
Mm-hmm.
And that is also the way we actually describe the grid of the United States, right? And so our approach to it is that it is, so you can take this kind of somewhat institutional approach. The grid, whether it is the city of New York, or dividing up land in the Midwest and beyond is an institution of land subdivisions, basically. It institutionalizes the framework in which how you divide up land, sell property, and so on and so forth. Economists work on this, and actually they make variety of arguments about the efficiency of creating land markets and creating value. In fact, there is actually a paper on the New York City grid which argues that land values are higher on the grid than below because it rationalizes land subdivision. It creates an institution in which it's predictable how land is subdivided and so on and so forth. We don't study the process of land subdivisions, but we take the framework of the institutional approach in this case, and we say it might also be, which is not something that other people have argued, it might also be an institution of land use incentives. It's a different thing. The commissioners drawing the grid, if we know anything about their actual intentionality based on the material they have left behind, their intention is to subdivide land for sale. They say it. We know it for a fact. They say it. They do not say anything about land use. It's not even on their radar. But we say that eventually, incidentally or maybe or whatnot, they also put into place an algorithm of land use incentives.
I forgot to say something
Okay.
kind of important in the talk.
Okay.
We were going so fast. I should have said it, well, I should have said it toward the end. Incidentally, right? And again, if we're thinking about, land use was not on the commissioner's radar, so much so that it wasn't until William Paris drew his atlas with his color coding of land use that those land use categories were invented, right? He invented them. And so when we talk about whether it's the drawing of the grid for land subdivision, for land sale, that's a sort of very formal representation of space that enters into this constant sort of Lefebvrean social spatial reproduction process, or it's simply the documentation, the drawing of the city that resulted from that, which is what William Paris did. Like he created an ontological structure that persists today, that it's not just that he documented land uses, that patterns before zoning that were then codified by zoning. He, in the sort of categorical decisions he made by making the map, this cartographic act, he established a way of thinking about urban space that persists, right? We still think of it in terms of residential, industrial, commercial, and a few other ones that we also added, but fundamentally we think of the city, its land use, and the opportunities afforded to us within the built environment, and even what mixture versus sameness is, because of a series of cartographic decisions that were formed because of the imperatives of and the sort of priorities of fire insurance underwriters, right? That it's the mapping, that cartographic analysis that also just feeds into that sociospatial reproduction and continues to sort of guide our experience of this space, but also real estate decisions and so on and so forth. Like, we are not good at live-work environments. We don't have a category for a live-work space. William Paris didn't come up with one. He separated back workshops from houses, and as a result, we might be okay with like retail on the ground floor and residential above. William Paris gave us that, and we are still really bad at a half residential, half commercial actual unit.
All right, thank you so much. This is really great. Thank you.
Thank you.